Hello, everyone. We have a very special episode from the North today. I'm so excited because this is a guest that I've been following on Twitter for a while and that talks about all the things we talk on this show. It's constantly calling out authoritarian regimes online and doing it in a way that really outlines what these regimes do to spread their propaganda and misinformation. I think it's so important that young people hear about the strategy of these regimes to spread their lies. So, Sophie, thank you so much for joining us from the North. It's so good to finally meet you.
Thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to meet you finally.
So Sophie is actually an expert on these issues. She's a lecturer on international relations and political science. So we got a real expert as actually your first guest on season 2 from the North. So very important episode today. Sophie is always, as I said, calling out misinformation, particularly I think about Syria.
Yeah.
And she has gotten, I mean, insane attacks, including from one of the people we loathe on this show, Mr. Glenn Greenwald. So Sophie, please give me just a little intro about how you are born and raised in the US. I think you're from Florida. We always talk about how Americans don't really care about these issues for some reason. Like no one cares about the 3 dictatorships in our Western hemisphere for
Yeah.
some reason. How did you get interested in this topic?
Well, thanks again for having me. So, how I got interested into this topic, well, specifically, my area of focus has been on the Middle East, specifically the Syrian conflict. So, it started, I think I had my political awakening around the Arab Spring. I was around, an age where it was something that really interested me, and the passion that I saw these young people have with trying to just ask for basic freedoms or reforms within their respective governments was really something that caught my attention. So when Syria happened, that was that was an extremely shocking event to me because how the regime was specifically targeting children. So there was this young child named Hamza al-Khatib, and he was 13 years old when he was forcibly disappeared by the regime, and he was tortured for many days before they finally just killed him. And so at that time, that story got international headlines just because of the brutality with which this child had been murdered. And at that point, it was kind of like, okay, I can't look away. So since then, my main focus has really been on the Syrian conflict. And it's been 10 years of watching just constant brutality and constant siege, with really the world not paying that much attention. And then on top of that, you have, for example, these disinformation actors that are coming in to try to whitewash the atrocities that we're seeing committed. So my area of focus, and what I went to school for, was basically human rights. I have a degree in human rights with a concentration in the Middle East. And then I just finished my graduate degree in political science, where I focus on disinformation around conflicts. And so now, like you said, I'm a lecturer of international relations at a New York university. And for me, what's been really interesting with that is a lot of the kids are at a different generation than I am at this point. And when we talk about topics like the Arab Spring, things like that, there was a formation of my political awakening with that. They have no idea. So I think that this is a really crucial point when we talk about disinformation and rewriting history. That what does this mean for the next generation? What are they going to be learning when, for example, we have Assad or these actors in the West who are actively trying to rewrite the history of the past 10 years in these areas. So that was a
Right.
long tangent.
No, that's amazing. So let's get right down to this disinformation. It's a word that, has been repeated so often over the last few years, but usually to talk about something very specific. When Americans talk or hear about disinformation, it's usually Republican
Yeah,
disinformation.
yeah.
And people they're not really trained to to spot disinformation from the really big bad actors around the world. I always mention in this show, the tyrants of places like Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, even Russia. They can't fight us yet militarily or economically. So what are the ways that they're fighting us?
Exactly.
With propaganda, and by kind of meddling into our cultural issues and spreading misinformation online, and really worsening the hyperpolarization that
Yeah.
we already have. So
Yeah.
tell me, Sophia, how these regimes, because it's very organized like efforts,
Yeah.
it's entire operations, and they all work very similarly. So tell me how these regimes work to spread their narrative in the free countries and the democratic countries.
Yeah, and I think before we get into that, I think you hit something that's really important that I also want to emphasize is that, for example, we saw Trump really making the term, fake news, the failing New York Times, stuff like that, a really popular term that I think it makes it harder for people like us to do our job, because what fake news has meant, I think, for the mainstream is that anything that you disagree with politically becomes fake news. And so I think that, that was something that I felt was a really big emphasis, because it makes our jobs harder to point out things that are factual that you may not like to hear, but they're
Mhm.
fact, being able to get in the mainstream. So that was the first point. In regards to your second question, I think that there's a plethora of ways these regimes try to get their specific narrative across. So, for example, in regards to Syria, you can have the regime say that, well, we don't use chemical weapons, it's the opposition. And I mean, it's a blatant lie that, some people will believe. I think the majority don't believe. What becomes a bit more complicated is when you have specific actors, like, for example, media that is owned by a government, able to infiltrate places in the West, or specific
Right.
political
We're talking about
ideologies.
places like Telesur, those
Yeah,
times.
yeah, RT, Russia Today,
Mhm.
where it becomes a bit more murkier, because what we found is that a lot of these, like Russia Today, for example, they own subsidiaries in the West that are modeled as, for example, grassroots organizations or grassroots media companies that in a big sense, they're modeled after, topics that a progressive would be interested in, like, um, unionizing, or pro-Palestine,
Or they make
healthcare
it a
for,
racial thing.
yeah, they make it racial. Like, they're really into, like, Black Lives Matter, stuff where it's like, wow, these people are really, like, with it. When you then dig deeper, you start to see, when it comes to the foreign policy aspect of this, it literally aligns perfectly with, what Russia wants the world to believe. So I can give you an example of Soapbox, which was this Russian funded media outlet that was directed towards, I think, Western youth, mostly Americans. And some of their stuff, it was very informative, like, talking about homelessness within the US. But then when you look, for example, at their foreign policy, their videos on foreign policy, it's a lot about how Assad never used chemical weapons, and that the US is trying to do regime change within Syria. And, so it becomes it becomes very specific to what they're trying to feed. And that's where, and you see them on places like TikTok, where you get a lot of younger people. Um, so I think that's where things get a bit more murky.
Right. And we always talk about that in this show, that they use our cultural wars to spread
Yes.
their propaganda. So they make it about race, they make it
Yes.
about feminism. I mean, we have groups like Code Pink that are out here
Yes.
supporting
I was just reading it.
Maduro, saying it's a feminist thing. But speaking about the chemical weapons thing in Syria, I think that's a really big lie that that the Assad
Yeah.
regime has managed to make people in the West believe. And I find that they always use the fact that the Bush 2 government lied about
Yeah. Yeah.
chemical weapons. It seems that they use the misdoings of the US in the past to say, well, nothing that the US says can be true. And then in the youth, it's like a cool thing, you know, like, yeah, we're
Yeah,
anti-imperialist. Like, why would we believe the CIA? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
I get called a CIA agent all the
yeah. I do
time.
too.
So, okay, how does that happen that someone, you know, I'm someone from Venezuela speaking out against my
Yeah.
dictatorship, and then an American calls me, a white American calls me a CIA agent? Like, how was that narrative so strongly built in the West?
Well, I think it actually goes to a point that you just said where they really try to, these nefarious actors really try to get to our cultural wars. So for example, you'll have people on the far right more aligned with the far left when it comes to topics like Syria, Venezuela,
The
Iran, and
isolationist.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
always the
the
horseshoe
isolationists.
theory.
Yeah, it always points back to that. And I think they've been successful in that. So for example, Russia a while back had this massive troll farm known as the Internet Research Agency. And they, like you said, they for example, they were targeting Black Lives Matter activists, trying to ingratiate themselves with them. But then they would go and try to ingratiate themselves in separatist movements with people that are trying to succeed from like
That's
far right
another
people.
one.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So there's no like there. I guess what I'm trying to get at is they're not specifically targeting like leftists or rightists. They're really, it's anybody that they feel like they can ingratiate their foreign policy or interests. And so that's where you see, for example, Aaron Mate, I'm sure your viewers know who he is, where he's retweeting people that are associated with the far right in Germany. So this horseshoe theory really comes alive
Well,
when
we
you
have
look.
Glenn Greenwald
Yeah,
appearing on
exactly.
conservative media constantly
Yeah.
now.
Or he's interviewing why is he Alex Jones, stuff like that, where there's no separation anymore when it comes to the far left and far right. I don't know if that answered your initial question, but I thought
Oh,
it was.
totally. So something I'm very interested in, because even though I'm fairly young, I'm mentally 80, so I don't know about TikTok, and like I'm really bad at these things.
Yeah,
But this is where I really wanted you to illuminate me, because I've seen, again, all these authoritarian regimes around the world, doesn't matter if they're right wing or left wing, they're working together.
yeah,
So I've seen you speak about how there are these influencers that go to Syria to spread a certain type of context or narrative. The same thing is happening in Venezuela. There are
yes,
these
yeah.
influencers that go and say, it's amazing here.
They
What
stay
are
in
people?
five-star hotels and everything.
Exactly. So tell me about this. Seems like, I mean, these regimes like are good at PR.
Yeah.
How do these influencers end up on these trips, and what is the nature of these trips?
Yeah, so the influencers will come in the disinformation apparatus. So, like, for example, you have the fully funded places like RT, which is, one apparatus of disinformation. The other is an interesting new way that these regimes are pushing out disinformation, where what they do, it's not directly the regime is recruiting people, but for example, the Syrian regime had this visa, a tourist visa that they just opened up, where only a handful of people could go into Syria and see Syria for themselves, basically, like the Syria that's not the media is orchestrating or whatever. So a handful of these travel influencers got this visa, and what the regime does is they work with travel agencies that really vet out, who can enter Syria and who can't. So for example, I obviously couldn't, you couldn't, because we're publicly, criticize these apparatuses. So these people claim to be apolitical, and I'm sure that many of them are. But the issue is that they're entering Syria on a regime sponsored visa. They're clearly being vetted to be able to just enter the country. And when you get into Syria, you can't walk around just willy nilly. You're being monitored 24/7. And so how you're being monitored is you have a tour guide or translator that's there basically to show you the sights and sounds, but they're directly connected to the government. So what we see, for example, in places like Homs that was completely leveled by the regime, a lot of these influencers are going there and saying things like, well, my tour guide told me that this is what the terrorists did. All these bomb buildings you see are what, the terrorists that were trying to overthrow the government were doing. The issue then becomes a lot of these influencers have a huge following, you know, like hundreds of thousands of YouTube subscribers or TikTok followers. And so what's happening is that you have a new generation that, for example, probably is not well versed of what's gone on in Syria for the last 10 years, that they're getting their information directly from these influencers that are saying, A, Syria is safe, you should come and have fun. And B, that what you see or what you've heard on the media isn't the truth. I know the truth because I'm in Syria on the ground speaking to actual Syrians. And so that's where this becomes extremely dangerous. And the other interesting thing about this is that because Syria has been a country that's been completely off limits for the majority of the world, it's become almost seen as an exotic place to go to. That if you're one of the first people to enter Syria, wow, like this isn't your normal trip to Bali or Dubai, that you're going into a place that not many people can go. And in a market that's so oversaturated with these travel influencers trying to make it, what we've seen is that if you can get like great footage from Syria, you can make it immediately. Your career takes off as an influencer. So one of these travel influencers, I remember Dawood, he had a following on TikTok, but when it came to YouTube, he had only like 700 subscribers. And I recently had checked, his Syria videos had gone viral and he has I think 70,000 YouTube subscribers now. So this is like a career, like to get into Syria, it's like a career maker at this point.
Oh God. I need a moment to take that
Yeah, I
in.
know.
It sounds it's exactly what they're doing in Venezuela.
Yeah.
And it's organizations like the Democratic Socialist of America.
Yes. I remember that.
I have gone on trips there, and like that just reminded me of one of them saw a street dog, and the way he said portrayed it was like, oh my gosh, I came across a commune dog, a commune socialist dog living his best life. Like that's the level of insanity of these first worlders who have never even come across a dog in the street.
And if I remember too, with Venezuela, they were literally staying in 5-star hotels.
Oh, absolutely.
The majority of people
and partying, living it up. And as you said, they treat it like an exotic place.
It's
the noble savage. They love that so much
term.
In the first world.
And everybody's happy to see you. Everybody's smiling. The other thing too, because now I'm focusing a bit on the Western agencies that are getting people into Syria. One of the narratives that they keep pushing is it's like you need to come to Syria because it's going to help Syrians rebuild. And then the other one, how they do that too is then they go on to advertise this hotel, this 5-star resort that you can stay in, where it's like, well, if you're paying us to get you in a resort, you're gonna help the economy rebuild. So it is kind of almost like this white savior complex too, that I need to go and and help these poor Syrians rebuild.
Misery tourism, which we have seen for decades in places like Cuba. I love how when I was in college, it became popular to go to Cuba, and these white wealthy kids Cuba would come back saying, oh my God, it's like the 60s. It's amazing. I am so glad I went before capitalism ruins it. I'm so glad I saw it before they put a Starbucks in here. It's like, do you think the people there are happy to be stuck in the 60s? Like they would love a Starbucks, but people want to have this miserable countries to go and dip and in and out of and have it be like a museum experience. I mean, it's so delusional.
That I think that's a great way of looking at it, because even when they go and film or take photos in front of destruction, it's seen as something that is like, well, that's just Syria now, and that's something that I need to experience before it's rebuilt, so it's really bizarre. And I think too, it goes back also to this white savior complex, where the other aspect of these disinformation agents are, like, for example, Code Pink, where, you know, you're talking about Cuba, where they're going into Cuba, you know, whitewashing, you know, what's going on in Cuba, and then coming back and actual Cubans are telling them to fuck off, excuse my language, you know. But and then they're like, wow, I wish, you know, Cubans will find the light one day and realize we're really with them. So I think there's different levels of this that we're hitting, and that these regimes are really capitalizing on.
Right. So as we also always discuss on this show, anyone who dares, it's funny to me because these tankies like think they're being like alternative and like, and really it's not like that. That's now like kind of like the popular view is to be
Yeah.
like anti-US and be like, well, but maybe Putin isn't the bad guy. But
Yeah.
whenever we speak against the regimes in Venezuela, in Russia, in Syria, there is always, and this is part of what Sophia has been talking about, it seems like a coordinated group of online people who find people who are tackling misinformation from these authoritarian regimes. And I mean, I've been at the center of it as well. And it's like immediate coordinated attacks. We're talking like
Yeah.
they'll look through all your tweets looking for specific
Yeah.
keywords to find like anything you've ever said that's going to discredit you as a person. They'll go
Yeah.
after your employer, which is why on this show we keep all the secrets,
Yes.
all that secret, because we really are in danger of these people trying to like destroy our entire lives for saying things like dictatorships are bad. So tell
Yeah.
me, Sophia, you were recently in the eye of the storm. I don't even know exactly what set up the attacks against you, but she found herself on a quote tweet by Glenn Greenwald. And when that happens, that means a big portion of the internet is coming at you to call you a Nazi, a racist, a CIA agent, all the things. So tell me about
Yeah.
that, Sophia.
So what happened was, um, it, it's so my focus has been on this individual named Aaron Mate, who's really gone into Syria and really done a lot of work to spread the regime's lies. So he had been invited on Russell Brand's podcast to speak about.
Who has become like a major actor in this
Yeah,
world,
he
hasn't he?
has. Yeah, and I think,
Yeah.
don't quote me on this, but I think he's even like now like an anti-COVID guy. So I think like any conspiracies he's attracted to.
It's just like
So
never believe the narrative that the
yeah,
US is
exactly,
sending out, no
exactly.
matter
Yeah.
what.
It's anything to disagree with. So he had Aaron Mate on his show. This guy is Russell Brand has a huge platform. And to have someone as dangerous as Aaron Mate that is clearly working to help the regime, I called it out. And so immediately, I don't even know how he found my tweet. Glenn Greenwald quote tweets me, and he's calling. It was very demeaning. He was saying things like, "Oh, is this how she also holds her classrooms as a professor? Does she silence people that go against U.S. regime narrative?" Whatever he was saying. And so immediately, I'm getting death threats. I'm getting rape threats. People are like searching up my affiliation with Columbia University, and it's like this barrage. And he knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, the goal, because this guy has over 1 million followers, the goal is to silence anybody that is, you know, goes against whatever narrative they're trying to say. I have in the past on a lesser level, every time I've been quote tweeted by Aaron Mate or some of his ilk, I do get this barrage of death and rape threats. And I think the idea is that they want to silence anybody that's getting too close to the truth or whatever. You know, it's too uncomfortable for them. And so it was so bizarre too with Glenn Greenwald, because though immediately he then takes the victim complex. So a few of my friends who are Syrian, including one who didn't know who Aaron Mate was, but he saw that he was being attacked. And so he quote tweeted what Glenn Greenwald had said. And then Glenn Greenwald started calling him a homophobe and like
That's his new
bizarre
thing.
things.
Yeah, that's his
Yeah.
new thing.
And my friend, he's a journalist in Idlib, and he's like WhatsApping me while this is happening, and he's like, I don't even know who this guy is. why would I, assume his sexuality if I'm just, sticking up for you because you're my friend? And he did that with every single Syrian that was coming to my defense. And I think he's like bringing in these tropes, or whatever he's assuming with, anybody who's defending me to try to silence the narrative and make himself a victim. And I've even noticed too that he does that every time he gets called out for going on Tucker Carlson's show, who has a very sordid history with, race and stuff like that, that he brings in his black husband. And, so it's like he's using these
He's the
people.
ultimate white savior.
Yeah,
and
he's
like,
the white
I
savior.
I walk the talk. I live in the third world.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, he lives in a nice ass mansion in Brazil.
Exactly. Yeah. Making millions of dollars. And so I think that was, and it was almost getting pathetic at the point where he just kept engaging, kept interacting, where it's like, just stop, dude. Like, we don't care what your sexuality is. All we care about is you're defending people, you're defending people that are literally helping the regime harm its own civilians, basically. Yeah. So that was, so that's happened, basically.
So this character, Glenn Greenwald, I always associate him with people like Edward Snowden because they were seen as progressive heroes.
They were, yeah.
So what has that pipeline been like from progressive hero to working for Putin and Assad? Like, what?
Yeah.
Explain that to me.
Well, I think he's always been pretty libertarian, to the point where I think when he was even a lawyer, he was, defending neo-Nazis in court. So I think there's always been that seedling there. I think, he became a household name through, the Snowden stuff and stuff like that. And it hasn't been until I think the past few years, people have really started to see him for who he is. And he's really been courting the alt-right. This is an individual that is courting the likes of Alex Jones and sticking up for people in the far right, where it's like there's no justification if you're a leftist to be able to still support whatever he's saying and what he's doing. And just the nastiness with how he goes about his business is really off-putting and so unprofessional in a sense. He's sicking his followers on smaller accounts. I don't have 1 million followers. I think I have like 5,000. And he also, the example of my friend in Syria, this is a journalist who's internally displaced within Idlib at the moment, trying to make a living, and he's sticking up for his friend. And Glenn Greenwald is sending millions of alt-right fanatics to attack an IDP.
It's enraging, but it's also not only alt-right fanatics, it's people from the far left.
Yeah, on the left too.
The extremists.
Yeah.
But that you're saying, it's again a common thread in the oppositions in all these countries. People like Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden, Tulsi Gabbard, that's another name in this circle. For decades, they have been depicting the Venezuelan opposition as terrorists, the Syrian opposition as terrorists and Nazis.
Now Ukraine too.
Now Ukraine. So that's what I was gonna say. It seems that because the Ukraine issue is so blatant and we watch Russia invade, it seems that's why people are now kind of seeing Glenn Greenwald for who he is. And while I'm happy about it, it is a little enraging that Venezuelans have been saying for 20 years, hey, this guy is lying. Like, I'm in Venezuela right now and Chavez is bad, and it's not because of the US sanction. But it is a textbook, right? Like, let's depict the opposition to these regimes as terrorists, as Nazis. Can you explain to me the Nazi thing? Like, how is the Venezuelan opposition Nazis? I mean, it's in Syria. They're brown people. Like, what?
They're automatically basically terrorists because they're brown people, do in a resistance movement. I think when you say they've gotten away with it for so many years, for example, in the Middle East, Syria, it hasn't really been a conflict like Ukraine that's been very cut and dry, so there's been a lot of moving positions when it comes to Syria. And so it's been easier for them to say, well, all the opposition, they're just terrorists. Everybody who's against the regime, supports terrorism, because also we're coming after the Iraq war, where it was so unpopular and these people were able to make a career out of exposing crimes, that the US has committed and should have been exposed because the US was doing awful things. But they haven't been able to also do the same. Let me back up for a second. With leftists, for example, I think they're easily persuaded by someone like Glenn Greenwald because of, the opposition of US interventionism in the past.
Anti-establishment is cool.
Yeah. And so it's like that. But now, for example, when you see Ukraine, it's a bit different because it's so easily like this was an invasion of a sovereign nation, and you can't really do those little tricks you were doing.
Even though they're still trying. I mean,
they're trying. Yeah.
People like Michael Tracy, who honestly,
he also attacked me too.
I used to read his blog before the Ukraine. I guess even I'm guilty of I didn't totally consider someone a propagandist until it was Ukraine, and I was like, dude.
Well, he's part of the Glenn Greenwald crew. So that I had known, because with Michael Tracy, he'd always been someone that had been on my radar, because I think he kind of toed with the Syria disinformation stuff, but he wasn't really fully into that group. I may be wrong. But with the Ukraine thing, I think it was something where it's like, okay, this guy's narrative, it's clear. He has a certain agenda that's not for civilians in Ukraine or, human rights. He's going to do his own agenda, like Glenn Greenwald or Aaron Mate, these all Tulsi Gabbard.
So what do you think the agenda comes from? Because there are many people that are wonder, are agents like Tulsi Gabbard literally paid, for example, her trip to meet Assad?
Well, yeah,
who paid for that?
Well, so there's a lobbyist, for example, when she was going to Damascus to meet with Assad, there was a lobbyist that is pro-regime that set everything up. And so there is, for example, some financial incentives with a lot of these people. I think a lot too is it's a career move, because a lot of these people are able to really find a niche set of people on both the far right and the far left and really gain a huge following. And so, for example, you get people like Aaron Mate, who's getting retweeted regularly by Susan Sarandon. So it just is.
Oh my God, that's another one.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the celebrities in this group. Susan Sarandon, Sean Penn dabbles in and out.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there are so many of them. The
Pink
Roger
Floyd guy.
Waters.
Yeah, Roger Waters. Yeah. So that's, for example, why going into something like this is attractive, especially if, for example, someone like Aaron Mate, where you can't get published or, in the mainstream, to be able to have a mass following and getting, this celebrity status amongst a small group of celebrities, there's incentive to do this. And the trips to Syria, the trips to Venezuela, you're getting perks.
Totally. And I actually think, and now I want to move to something you also know about, the academic world, because I connected to that. As someone who went to a fancy university in the US, the professors were usually spending their time talking about US crimes, Iraq. I mean, I always say Iraq was so harmful in so many ways. But one that people don't often talk about is that Americans lost that belief that the US can be a force of good,
especially on the left.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when I was in university, they weren't talking about the atrocities of the Soviet Union, of Stalin, of China, of Cuba. It was always the US portrayed as a bad actor in the world, and really this is something I also wanted to ask you about. A big disinformation piece that's so common is the reason all these countries are struggling is US sanctions.
Yes. Yeah, the sanctions is a big one. That all the human rights violations you're seeing being committed,
Exactly. Or
and it's
people are
yeah,
starving to death in Venezuela, for
it's because of
example,
yeah,
because of US sanctions.
it's so American centric because it literally takes the agency away from the perpetrators. That no brown person or anybody beyond the US could be responsible for also committing atrocities. And I think that that's almost shows to where the privilege is as someone sitting in an American university setting where you can only view it through the prism of the US. And when you do that, you're denying agency from people in these countries that are saying, no, hey, like my house was bombed by Assad. I can't feed my family because of Maduro. So you're literally taking the agency away from these people to raise their voice and really tell their truth.
I also say it's actually racist because
Yeah, it
brown
is.
people can be good and they can be bad and they
Yeah,
can vote for bad regimes and they can be dictators and they can do all the things white people can do.
yeah. No, you're so right. I think one of the most jarring of examples was when Trump it was after one of Assad's gas attacks. Trump was going to do the strike on Assad's military bases. And so one of these like opinion pieces, op-eds did columnists where, people could write in about the Trump strikes. One person wrote in saying that imagine if Syria bombed us for gassing our people for, protesting at college universities. It was something so banal,
Right.
not to
For
make,
the American government's
yeah,
human right violation.
yeah. It's not to make light of whatever that, the specific example of that individual was, trying to compare the Syria atrocities to. But I mean, the US right now is not going to gas you, if you're going to protest
It's
for
just a
like Black Lives.
fact.
Yeah, they're not going to come into like Upper West Side and like gas the entire neighborhood. That's what's happening in
They're
Syria.
also not going to put you in jail if you oppose
Yes.
I mean, it should
Yeah.
be something that's just
Yeah.
basic common sense to
It,
understand this. Like, and this is something we talk about here too. Like, you have to have some perspective. Yes, we have issues in the US. They are not
yes.
comparable to the issues in these other places.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you're living in the US compared to like, for example, living in Idlib, I mean, you have a much better existence. And there's, mechanisms in place that allow you to, for example, report police brutality, so there's things that are given to you as an American. And as Americans, I think this happens a lot on the left. You can't be selfish with this. You can't always just point to the US because it also brings it back to you. Well, my government's doing this. My government, well, other people have governments that are also doing bad things. So that's my tangent.
No, yeah, it makes total sense. But so before we started recording, you were saying that now when you're in a, higher education context, that you find that maybe this is changed. I'm always concerned about the
Yeah.
universities, truly, because again, I remember how the idea, like I was told Chavez was good in a classroom.
Yeah.
And I was like, but I'm from there. He wasn't. And then the fancy professor starts going on about US sanctions. So this is my concern, that is the relation and why, or a big part of why the American youth is so leaning towards believing the propaganda from
Yeah.
places like Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. I think the first is that a lot of the younger generations, they've grown up, around or were born around the Iraq War, and the implications that that had. And so there was really this idea that anytime the US does something, especially in the Middle East, they're trying to extract oil, they're doing stuff for
Oil,
nefarious
of
reason.
course,
Yeah,
regime
the
change for
oil.
oil.
Yeah, stuff like that. And so I think that's happening. And, for example, in my classroom, what we've really been trying to do is not view these regions as a monolith. Every country has its own set of issues. And so, for example, it wouldn't be appropriate to compare Iraq to what's happening in Syria because, there's different things happening on the ground, different international actors, stuff like that. So that's my first point. The other thing that's been really interesting to me is because I'm coming from a different generation than them. As I said, what really was my political awakening was stuff like the Arab Spring. And so when I say in the classroom, like, what's the Arab Spring? None of them have any, understanding,
But
so
they know about Iraq, which was
yeah,
before.
yeah, which
So
is a good
that's
point.
interesting to
That is
me.
really interesting because you would think that both would hold some weight, especially, something like the Arab Spring that massively changed, politics, not just in the region, but internationally. Um, so it's been interesting. I'll be honest, I was a bit hesitant coming into teaching at more of a leftist university in New York, where I was told the demographics by my boss when I came that they'll probably be a bit, further to the left, more social justice. And so I was curious, when we would speak about stuff like the Uyghurs or you know, types of different interventionism, the right to protect, stuff that we need to discuss when talking about international relations. What I've seen so far is that they're very receptive to even things like, for example, should Obama have gone through with his red line? Stuff where I'm almost a bit iffy. There's been debate and they've been really open to it. We were talking about the Rohingya, we were talking about Uyghurs. So far there hasn't really been anything that where I'm like, whoa. So for example, we were talking about universal jurisdiction and what that means. And so they were like, well, we should go and any US president that has gone through and done bad things in the Middle East, they should be charged under
Right.
universal jurisdiction. So I think there is kind of that mentality, but I want them to view these as not a whole monolith.
Totally. On the role, or what the role of the US internationally should be. This is
Yeah.
something we always talk about in this show because isolationism is cool because again, people have this idea that every time the US has intervened, it's a bad thing. No one wants to talk about World War II, right? That intervention doesn't matter. That should have been way before it was, but that's another topic.
Well, it's funny you brought up World War II. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm even attacked when I bring up US's involvement in World War II on Twitter. So I think with, some of these people, like anything the US does.
But what's interesting? I always find that so fascinating because back in the time of World War II, we also had the Glenn Greenwald isolationist saying peace, and they call it peace. We're pro peace. Let Hitler annihilate Europe for peace. So I think the US should play a big role abroad because the way I see it, we got three options: Russia, China, and the US. There's going to be one empire, and I'd rather it be the US. It seems voters no longer believe that, in part because of the most recent interventions we have seen have not been successful. Obama and the fucking red line. I mean, like, it's been a while, although I think in Ukraine we're seeing how US intervention can be good. But how do you think, Sophie, the US should be fighting back? Because it's harder for us because we're a democracy. So we can just do, our president can just do whatever he wants, like Putin can, how Assad can. He has to deal with public opinion. He has to deal with the isolationists who say, why should our money go to save other people? That's another aspect of this. Is the US fighting back on these propaganda efforts of these regimes? People say the CIA. I'm like, I wish they would be doing what they say they're doing. Is the CIA also having, propaganda efforts? Let's call it that. Are they fighting back in these communication wars? And how should we fight back?
That's an interesting question. I think what we've seen since probably the Bush era is this push towards isolationism on US foreign policy. Looking at Obama, where, there was this pride of him getting troops out of Iraq, and he even campaigned on, with 2012. That was one of his big campaign issues,
And he
or what.
also did like tours apologizing for US
Yeah,
imperialism.
so there I think there's been this push, and so we saw it with Obama with the red line. We saw it kind of with Trump. I mean, he was, for example, doing the airstrikes in Syria, stuff like that. But then again, you have him say, make America great again. This populist
We
mentality that's
shouldn't
bringing
be the
every.
policemen of the world. That's the
Exactly,
common
yeah.
line.
Where he was flirting with, pulling out of NATO. We were out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I shouldn't even say kind of with Trump. We saw it with Trump. But I was thinking of the U.S. airstrikes in Syria. But so we saw it with Trump. We're kind of seeing it with Biden, with Afghanistan, where there was that rush to get everybody out, all the Americans out, and then people, children are holding on to the airplane. So there's this. I think it's attractive to continue on this US sphere of isolationism. I don't necessarily agree with it because, like you said, what are our other options? We have China, which is a digital authoritarian state, which is monitoring all of their
I
citizens.
love that phrase. That's exactly
Digital
what it is. And
authoritarian,
you
yeah.
mentioned TikTok. I mean, that's
Yes,
another.
yes. They own TikTok. And try to go and find stuff on Uyghurs or the workers' rights within China. So we have China, or you have Russia, where, I mean, at this point I shouldn't even have to explain what Russia's doing because it's been so obvious. And so I agree with you where you may not like it, but if we want to see some form of democracy, liberal institutions being able to continue and move forward, there needs to be the US not, being an isolationist mechanism that is just too afraid to act in any capacity because they don't want, a global backlash, like with, for example, Iraq. What we were talking about in my class, for example, is we were talking about realism and what realism means. And for example, I gave the example of Obama falling back on his red line and how that emboldened Putin and Assad to continue on this massacre inside Syria. And then Putin goes on to do the exact same playbook he did in Syria in Ukraine. So I think that, like, bringing in, going back to academia, bringing in types of examples like that, where we can see, well, maybe if the US did do something in Syria, we wouldn't have such a mess in
I
Ukraine
always
at the
bring
moment.
up, Sophie, maybe if the US did something in Cuba, we wouldn't have three
That's
dictatorships in the
interesting.
Western Hemisphere today.
That's really interesting. I didn't even put two and two together. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's funny you brought up Cuba because one of my students, she did a great paper on the wet foot, dry foot policy with Cuban asylum seekers. And I didn't realize this because growing up in Florida, it was always kind of known if you're Cuban and you can get to Florida, you can seek asylum. She told me that Obama stopped that policy. And I was a bit shocked, and we connected it back to realism and isolationism and what that means. And again, I don't think that, even those I shouldn't say micro, but those policies that are kind of on a smaller level, I think that they add up to this isolationist
I
approach that the
agree
US is
with you.
taking.
I mean, that's actually been heartbreaking for me. And I have a hard issue talking about it because even Cuban Americans who are born here, so they're super progressive, they're
Yeah,
like, well, we shouldn't have a special, like, a special place in the immigration system. Like,
yeah,
but it's so sad seeing every day, Cubans are trying to get to Florida on a raft and now they're
yeah,
sent back. I mean, but it's part of, again, this US isolationism that's so
yeah.
popular. Like, why should we be helping? And it's funny to me how, like, so often it's from progressives. Like,
It
how
is,
is this
yeah,
progressive? Like, we have representatives like AOC and Ilhan Omar who should take
yeah,
more of, they come from, well, not AOC, she's completely American, but someone like Ilhan Omar, I always say I
yeah.
thought she would be an ally to the countries
No.
who are oppressed around the world, and instead she says it's the US's fault.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with you. She's been a major disappointment. And I think she's been more of a disappointment than, for example, AOC, which I think is a bit more careful with her
Yeah.
wording. Not to say I'm for everything the squad does, especially with foreign policy, but Ilhan, oh my gosh, I remember too she was one of the few that didn't vote for the Caesar sanctions on Assad. She also she refused to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. You know, things where it's like,
she's an extremist, and I think it's scary to me that these people are now in Congress. So something we want to do on this show, but Edo and I are convinced that we're going to get shadow banned, because we want to
oh
start like
no,
going on TikTok and like talking about the things we talk about.
that
What
yeah.
do you think we would get shadow banned? Like if you go on TikTok and you say all the things we're talking about right now, like how controlled is TikTok really, and how dangerous it is? Because I recently saw something that like Americans are spending like most of their time on this platform that's controlled
Yeah,
by China.
TikTok is superseding even Instagram with the amount of time people spend on it. And it's really interesting how they get you into this whole like TikTok addiction. But with TikTok, because I was doing a lot of work around TikTok and how disinformation, you know, the Assad regime's using that platform to spread disinformation. And what we found is videos that specifically are just major misinformation, they're allowed to stay up, even though TikTok has a mechanism that you can report like COVID misinformation, atrocity misinformation. It's not being honored. And so, even for example, with you know what's happening in China, like you know what we were talking about before, the human rights issues, you're not gonna it's not gonna be pushed up in the algorithm where a vast amount of people will be able to, you know, access it. Um, and I think that is a bit concerning just moving forward. And I think it's a great, you know, if you're China, this is a great way for you to really spread specific content or what you want people to hear in the Western hemisphere. Because if you think about it, they really are able to control what gets boosted in the algorithm and what doesn't. I have a few friends that have been shadow banned or just banned for being too, I don't know, disrupting the peace of TikTok. I don't know. So yeah,
Terrifying. It's
but
modern warfare,
yeah,
really.
yeah,
Do you think literally, like I imagine it, like are there like it's so Orwellian, and I know like everyone keeps saying it, but
yeah,
like I think these regimes literally have like propaganda like departments, like people that are constantly working on like, okay, what's the narrative,
yeah.
how are we going to spread it, like
Well, going back to the travel influencers, we've seen, for example, that when the influencer goes into Syria and does a YouTube video and says Syria's safe, Syria's fun, come party, those exact words will come into Syrian state media like a day later. And so it's not even like they're trying to hide, you know, the benefits of the regime. And so I think it comes down to us as global citizens that we really need to be mindful of what the media we're consuming, how we're consuming it, in the framing. You know, why is something framed the way it does? Is it to serve a specific narrative, you know, or you know, to help a perpetrator? And so, because they're not going to be doing, uh, I guess the people that are put in place to stop this aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing.
correct. So yeah, that was going to be my last question for you. Like how can we as citizens of the world, especially when it comes to areas of conflict like Ukraine, Syria, how can we, you know, assess the information that we get, and how can we differentiate between propaganda and fact? Because to be honest with you, and we got to mention it, we had an episode about this, like it is modern warfare. So even
Yeah,
in the issue with Ukraine, like I'm pro Ukraine forever, but like
yeah,
they spread some misinformation
they
too.
do.
To
Yeah.
like it's warfare to, you know, morale, whatever it is. So even I have fallen for things. Like I remember what was it? There's been a few like misinformation pro Ukraine things, like the
There,
pilot who shut down all those
yeah,
planes.
yeah.
Or like,
There's,
you know, so even someone like me, or like the people who watch the show, because to be honest, the people who watch the show know that these dictators are bad.
yeah.
um but how can we make sure that the information we're consuming is factual, and how can we teach ourselves to be critical, and even if it's something that's from our side?
Yeah, I think the big thing is first, because we're all human, is recognizing our own personal bias, you know, and that's the first thing. Because, you know, I've fallen for that too on the Ukraine thing too, where I think one of their official media capacities was saying something that was completely, you know, untrue. And so I think recognizing our own bias, and then also I always tell people, engage with people on the ground first. So when it comes to Syria, Ukraine, I tell all my students, get a Twitter account, follow people that are on the ground, follow the photojournalists that may not be associated with CNN, or because even those, the CNN news anchors, they're at some point getting their information from people on the ground, the researchers. So do stuff like that. I think those are my main points. It is challenging, and I think that this points to also where what you keep saying, where we're going with warfare, where we're going with, attacking our adversaries. It'll be more misinformation, disinformation campaigns on places like social media. I think too, it is a bit hard right now, especially in the US, because we're so divided, to really have this type of conversation, because even domestic politics, fake news is just, that's the big word everybody uses, even with stuff that they don't even like. So it's a challenging question that I think as we continue to evolve, I think that we'll have a more clear answer.
Wow, this conversation was amazing, Sophie.
Well,
We
thank
definitely
you.
have to have you back on this
I would
show.
love to.
So yeah, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for watching our little chat about disinformation, and we'll see you next time.